Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to the Artsy Raven podcast. I'm your host, J.F. Garrard, and today's episode is called Writing About Surviving in an Indifferent Violent World, and we'll be speaking to Ed Seaward, author of Fair. So Ed completed his first novel, Son of Jack Nasty, in 2011, as yet unpublished, and since then he has written a number of short stories and screenplays, including Mother-Daughter Happiness, which was a screenplays finalist at the 2019 Pasadena International Film Festival. His novel, Fair, was published by the Porcupine Quill in 2020. After 30 years in the corporate world, he now spends his time cashing pension checks, which sounds very nice, writing and volunteering with Canadian Authors Toronto. He and his wife, Barb, split their time living in Georgetown, Ontario and Santa Monica, California. Well, they did COVID and plan to return once the world has the pandemic under control. So thank you very much, Ed, for being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me. This is wonderful. Thanks, Jeannie.
So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about yourself and why you started writing?
Well, writing comes from reading, I always believe, and so I was an early reader, and I love both, throughout childhood. When I got to university, towards the end of university, I thought of journalism as a career, and I was at the University of Western Ontario in the late 70s and 1980, and they just opened up a master's program for journalism there. So that was the plan, and then impetuously, which is maybe the adverb that describes much of my life, I decided, no, I won't do that. When I graduate, I will write screenplays. I can't possibly go back and know why I made that decision, but I worked long enough to save some money so that my wife and I got married as soon as I graduated, so that she was at least somewhat tolerant that I wasn't going to work every day. I was in the basement of our place and at an old Smith Corona electric typewriter. And I wrote, turned out to be 3 screenplays. The first one, which is now called Telefilm, which was Canadian Film Development Corporation. They actually did a treatment of it. And I wandered around Toronto banging on doors, which led me to somebody who wanted a different kind of screenplay, and led me to somebody else, and led to none of them being sold and no money coming in, and life takes over, as they say. And I won't go through all of the various jobs, but I ended up going to work for a large energy company at the time, Union Gas. It actually doesn't exist anymore, but and that started a 30-year career. And I drifted away from writing. Again, get busy in life, and many years later, during as I was getting into sort of the 50 age, the old symbolic midlife crisis hit, and I realized that all of my issues really stemmed from the fact that I wasn't doing the one thing I always thought I wanted to do, which was to write. And I'd had this novel kicking in my head for many, many years. Written the first 4 chapters in my head. I spent a lot of time on the road in my job, which was Son of Jack Nasty. And so eventually I sat down and started to write on weekends. It took me 2-3 years, finished it. And as I was trying to get it published, I turned to Fair, which I'd had the idea for a bit, and I worked it out and wrote it. And then somewhere on there, I decided, could I enjoy screenplay writing? So I wrote 4 different screenplays, and again, none of those sold. Although you mentioned Mother-Daughter Happiness, I did get at least some success that they accepted it as a screenplay only in the competition. I was a finalist, so I got to attend the Pasadena a little film festival, though I didn't win. So that was fun.
I actually don't know much about the screenplay industry. Like, do you sort of shop out your screenplays to producers and then someone buys it? Is that like, how does it work?
That's it. And so if you think it is difficult to get a book published, try dealing in the world of film. There are also, again, like writing short stories and novels, there are a lot of contests out there, and so I did that, and they were open to that. Not closest, but I did have a sit down with a Canadian film director who I met, she provided or showed her film. It was called Mouthpiece in Palm Springs, and I introduced myself, and they got together with her later on. She was also in Santa Barbara at a film festival. We talked a bit about my screenplay over a cup of tea, but it never went anywhere. So that's the touch. And being in California, I've met a few people. I be honest, I continue to look for some avenues, particularly that last one. But my focus is really on writing novels.
Well, that's true because you fly between California and Toronto, so you deal with both. I guess, are you in part of any writing communities in California?
I joined something called Right Away, which is a writing group, meets every Tuesday, and I stay connected online when I'm not there, and it's a combination of people who are writing strictly for themselves, people who are trying to get published or trying to complete something, and a number of professional writers who are at the end of their careers. One was a screenwriter for television in television, wrote all kinds of episodes of things like Mod Squad, for those old enough to remember shows like that back in the 60s and 70s. And another fellow was a journalist for AP for 30 years, a former Vietnam vet. So there's this wide range of folks, some published, some poets. So it's wonderful. That was the thing when the second year that we started to spend time down there after I retired. And when I stumbled on this group, that was it. I knew I was going back every year. The weather and the writers.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. But yeah, I was told that actually, to be a writer, being a television writer, like you would make a lot of money if you made it. Like if you get your name in the credits, like per episode, you get thousands of dollars. But it's just getting there to that point is
Where the
hard.
money is. There's no question. It's where the money is. But it is, forever, more competitive. It's funny when you're in Los Angeles. Almost everybody that serves you a drink or a meal is a screenwriter.
I was gonna say, aren't they actors and actresses?
Yeah, same thing. Yeah. They're all waiting for that next. They're all Penny from Big Bang, right? So yeah,
Oh
would be
boy.
screenwriter or actor. So it's music.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about Fair. It sounds kind of scary because I was reading the synopsis about dealing with the real life situations of homelessness and gangs. Like, was it inspired by your stay in California?
No, I actually wrote this before. I mean, I'd been to California, sort of family vacation. My wife and I, and my son was, I don't know, 12, 13 years old. So we've been down a couple of times. It was actually inspired, the seed of it came from an essay I read in a Toronto newspaper about somebody on death row. So it's, which led to this idea of fair. I mean, the person had committed heinous crimes, but it was, you read further in, he himself had been abused from the moment he was born, physically, emotionally, sexually abused, was a fetal syndrome, suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome. So it got me thinking with this whole idea of what is fair, in terms of, because certainly, what he did to his victims wasn't fair, but from there, what I wanted was not to go into the complexities of his crimes or guilt. What I was struck with was thinking of a completely innocent person. I had this vision, this image of this young homeless man wandering the beach away from the pier, and something that, because I'd spent some time there, was somewhat familiar with. And when I got to writing it, it really became about that. And so the interesting for me is the feedback, because I take it, with happy to receive the feedback I have with gratitude, because people talk about the images and feel that I painted a picture of the place, not only Venice Beach, but Skid Row, which is downtown Los Angeles, the largest homeless community in the States or Canada. But for me, the essence of the novel was actually a fall from innocence, of this young man who ends up being terrorized, and he and his friend is known as the Professor. It also what I was trying to do was to also write about, comment on whether that idea of innocence is in and of itself just a myth, right? Whether anything is really innocent. And I do that. There's people have read the novel. There's an exploration of the epic poem Paradise Lost, and it's being read to Ian by the professor. And so this whole mythology of the idea of paradise and the idea of innocence. So all of that is there, but in telling the story, you need a character, and you need a story, you need a plot. And so in doing that, I think that what has drawn people into it has been they find Ian relatable, even if they're somewhat horrified of what he goes through in life. And again, the feedback I received is they find the depictions of life on the streets in Venice Beach or in other parts of Los Angeles, including Skid Row, to be compelling. So it's good from that point of view, but there is a sense of hopelessness to it. And that's, if there's one that people question me on, is the ending. We won't do any spoiler alert, but there's a sense of is there a bit of hopelessness, which I leave for people to think about in terms of, as we talk about what is fair and about innocence and all of these things. I want readers to have that conversation with themselves. So.
Yeah, you remind me of a lot of comedians that are like, they tell really funny jokes, but they're like the most depressing person ever. Although for you, I think you're a very happy person, but then you're telling depressing stories. So it's like the opposite. So like with your screenplays and your books, do you have a process to plot out the story? Like, do you think it's not similar writing screenplays versus a novel?
Well, it's the fundamental difference for me is the screenplay comes as a format, right? There is a including the type, right? It comes back to an old style of type because what they learned back in, I think as far back as maybe the 30s, is that the type on a typewriter, if you used a particular type, one page translated to about 1 minute of film time. So if you have a 90-minute screenplay, you should have roughly 90 minutes of film. If you have 180 pages, you got a film that's way too long, and somebody better edit it. So it's the way in which it's formatted, which is interesting. With a novel, is much more to me the blank page. You can fill it with anything. A novel can be short, fair or short, just over 40,000 words. The first novel I wrote, Jack Nasty, was 140,000 words. So the structure is really up to you within a novel. I mean, again, you can be very traditional with it if you choose. And I think if you write genre, there are expectations of the genre that you write and how it'll be laid out. But you can also play with that genre too if you so choose. So in terms of process, I think I'm still playing with process, though I do now write out plots, probably thinking about chapters, and I do that. I just use a Word document. I'm comfortable in a Word document. I use actually a table. I put a table in a Word document, and I will create some bullet points in there. I will think about characters and maybe write some backstory on characters. Sometimes I do that completely, and sometimes I do that a little bit in parallel, or at least I fill in as I'm thinking ahead of the novel. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I will take those notes and put that in. The one difference in Fair was I saw it as a series of images. It was very clear in my mind, starting with that image of the young man, the beach. So when I wrote it, I actually wrote the first draft as blank verse, and I simply wanted to focus chapter by chapter on the central images in that chapter. And then the second draft, I turned it into conventional prose. I've not done that. I don't see myself necessarily doing that again. It was really driven by the need, which was the image, or the images. That the whole novel needed to be driven by images.
So for Fair, after you finished it, how did you shop it around? Did you try to get an agent or anything?
Yeah, so and actually with Son of Jack Nasty, which I was never successful with, I did that. I wrote query letters to agents, and then when I didn't get anywhere, went to those publishers, which are smaller independent publishers, not the the large publishers won't accept query letters. You have to know somebody inside or have an agent, and it wasn't successful. I started that process after I finished Fair, and then I was getting close to the time I got to be taking pension checks instead of paychecks from the company. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to have lots of time to work this out. So I set that aside and I just went back to writing other things, screenplays, started another novel. And then after I finished up at the company, it actually took me a year to get on it because I had all the time in the world. And of course, I did nothing with the time, which is, the old saying, if you want to get something done, give it to a busy person, right? Because that's, the people.
Well, I'm sure you were doing something, eating lots of.
Yeah, well, more enjoyable than life at the beach, whatever. So I did, but I went right back through the whole process again. Didn't get an agent. Spent some time on trying to search American agents simply because I thought it might be compelling because it was set in Los Angeles. Was unsuccessful, and went through the smaller publishers. And the only one that really got back to me was Porcupine's Quill, and delightfully they liked it. The editor, who is actually just works on not even really a contract basis, but a case by case basis. They hired it both, to review incoming manuscripts and then to also edit. And she was the one that had read it, liked it, and recommended Porcupine's Quill take it on, which they did. So that was the breakthrough.
So after you decided to go with them, you went through an editing process, and did you have any say on the cover design or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I had input. I mean, the publisher, Tim, it's a husband and wife of Porcupine's Quill, small publisher in Erin, Ontario, but extremely well respected. They actually received the Order of Canada a number of years ago, so they've been around since the 70s. But Tim is an artist, poet himself, and an artist, and he had some very strong ideas on the cover, but he did show me different ways that he could lay it out, including the type. And so I did have input. In the end of the day, I really ended up going with everything he had recommended, and I'm glad I did. I was hesitant at first. It took me a bit, but now I look at the cover and I love it. And in fact, the cover is, and he just pulled this off online, but is a photograph of an area about 7 blocks from where we stay, in Santa Monica. So that's that really intrigued me at the end. And for those of you who bought Fair, you'll note that it's illustrated, and those illustrations come from a publication back in the 19th century of Paradise Lost, and the publisher had done wood carvings, and then he did imprints from wood carvings of various scenes from Paradise Lost. So it's an illustrated novel as well, and again, that was all his idea, and I love the idea.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, very few novels have illustrations, like unless they're special editions. So there you go. First one is a special edition for you.
Yeah. I think it's a beautiful, I mean, forget the writing, but I think it in and of itself is a beautiful novel. I mean, he does all of the printing and the binding himself. He's still a hands-on publisher. It's old school. There's only a few of them left in Canada, and 3 or 4 maybe, not even that many perhaps. So it's in and of itself, it's just a beautiful book.
Okay, a few questions to wrap things up. So can you tell us the latest project you're working on, and where can people find you and your book?
What I'm working on right now is I'm the 3rd draft of a novel called Confessions of a Violent Man. So it's I'm working through. I've had lots of feedback, and working through that feedback and trying to adjust what I can within the novel that still fits the novel that I want to write. So I'm deep into that process. In terms of finding me, it's edseaward.com, www.edseaward.com. If you go there, there's a section that shows you all the independent stores you can go and order the book from, obviously online, any of the online retailers, or from Porcupine Quill themselves. They will sell. So, but if you go into edseaward.com, there's information there on where to buy the novel.
Yeah, I'd like to point out too that Fair is available as a paperback on Amazon, but if you want the ebook, it's only available on Porcupine's Quill, I believe. So you have to go to the
Right.
main website.
Right.
Now, we're going to have a treat now. Ed's going to give us a reading from his work. So could you tell us a little bit before you start reading?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I guess in our discussions of the novel, the protagonist, his name is Ian, a young homeless man. The novel, it's told in the third person, but it's exclusively told through his point of view. So he's on every page. There are some other important main characters. One I think I mentioned earlier is the professor. So I thought what I would do is read two chapters, both are short. Every chapter in the novel is short. That talks, shows a little bit of the relationship between Ian and the professor and each individual, as well as where they live, where the parts of LA that they're at. So you say there's going to be two different chapters. Chapter 32 is first. Ian rests one hand on the wobbly wheeled shopping cart as the professor pushes it around the downtown streets. The two walk together without any sound except their scuffling soles and heels and the incessant squeak of the wheels. Squeak, 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 squeak. They rest for a moment. Others walk around them. Thousands of men and women with tattered boots and frayed shoes, scuffling sidewalks next to chain link fences and concrete walls, and resting in blue and yellow and red and green tents. Ian reaches into a side pocket of his knapsack and draws out a cigarette. The professor does not smoke. He does not drink, nor does he do any sort of drugs. The professor does not object to Ian smoking and tilts his aged body against his shopping cart for support as Ian lights the cigarette under the unrelenting sun. A craggy, misaligned black woman passes them. Her cart's wheels do not wobble, do not squeak. Her cart contains 3 or 4 potted plants. Ian does not know the names of the plants, but he knows the woman's name is Brienne. As she passes, Ian hears the unexpected voice of the professor. "Good day, Brienne." "Good day to you, Professor," she replies, pushing her plant cart along. As the professor watches Brienne continue down the street, he says to Ian, "My wife loved artificial plants, not cheap rubbery plastic plants, but beautiful lifelike silk plants. Still, I could never understand the purpose of an artificial plant. What is its point if it does not provide oxygen? It has no aroma. You know, Ian, that may be the very last thing I ever said to my wife before she hanged herself in the laundry room. What is the point of these artificial plants?" Ian looks toward the professor, but does not ask for further explanation of his wife or of her death. It is not often that the professor speaks in the daytime. It has been weeks since he last spoke, and as Ian crushes his cigarette butt into the sidewalk, he is surprised when the professor speaks again. "My wife committed suicide." Ian turns the word over in his mind. "Homicide," the professor says. A rhyming of words, as if he read Ian's thoughts, as if he peered into Ian's dizzy mind and plucked out the word homicide rolling around in the mud and rhymed it with suicide. The professor continues to rhyme in a quiet, protracted voice. He stands and speaks the unhurried words of the undaunted. Suicide, homicide, patricide, matricide, fratricide, infanticide, filicide. The professor stops and is quiet for a moment, then starts again. Infanticide, filicide. Quick, Ian, write me a 500-word essay on the difference between infanticide and filicide. Ian looks blank, lost, with no idea of what the professor means by this request. The blank look transforms into terror at his inability to answer. The professor reaches over and brushes Ian's shoulder. "I'm only kidding, Ian. I'm sorry. I was just teasing you. I should not tease. It is not nice. I am sorry." Ian relaxes and nods without any real purpose. He sets the fingers of one hand on the palm of the other and taps. Now the professor pushes the wobbly wheeled cart. Ian stops tapping, places a hand lightly on the side of the cart, and moves in a steady rhythm next to the professor. In the distance, Ian can see the misaligned meander of Brienne as her aligned shopping cart of potted plants pushes through 1,000 homeless, wandering souls in this place. Skid Row. Chapter 37, which is some time later. Gargoyles whirl around Ian in his dreams. He knows he is dreaming, but cannot wake up. Gray gargoyles, having dislodged themselves from cathedrals and mansions and universities, fill his toothless, sunken, mushy head with voices as hideous as their grotesque, twisted faces. Come and fly, you can leave with us, they screech as they whirl around his head. Ian awakens on this moonless night in utter darkness. He cannot see, but he remembers that he is at his special place in the park. He remembers that after he bought the professor a hamburger deluxe with white milk and told him of Mark, the professor, having left his wobbly-wheeled shopping cart with Michael, trucked away to somewhere. So Ian left the streets and walked here and found a special place in the park as darkness came with the edge of night. It is so very, very late that Ian does not fear lighting a cigarette, because he knows that he will not be seen by those whose job it is to keep him from sleeping in the park at night. Ian taps the red ember of the cigarette on the palm of his other hand and thinks of gargoyles. It seems bizarre that the professor would tell him such stories when he'd only started to talk of the weather. Ian recalls the professor speaking oddly one day, on and on and on, talking of how much cooler it was along the beach, even though during the summer people insisted on dressing in bathing suits and short shorts. Here along these streets, the professor said, it was much hotter. Everywhere, though, the sun is relentless. Then the rain came, so unusual in summer, the professor said, and they found a little shelter and watched a roaring summer rain pour from roofs. And then the professor began to tell Ian about gargoyles. Gargoyles began as waterspouts as far back as early Egypt, he said, disguised waterspouts to divert rainwater from buildings. When the rain stopped, the professor quit talking of waterspouts, but continued to talk of gargoyles. He described dragons and lions with grotesque heads, and ogres and serpents, winged creatures, humans and animals melded in monstrous shapes, perched on ledges and cornices and towers, ready to leap off and fly away. The professor told Ian of admiring the gargoyles of Notre Dame Cathedral, a large church in Paris. The professor told Ian he had climbed to the bell tower, old home of Quasimodo, the cathedral's motherless bell ringer, a hunchback as monstrous looking as the gargoyles. The professor said he looked over the city of light, he called it. Paris, the city of light. Not our city, though, Ian. Ours is the city of angels. Later, Ian wrote those words in his modest notebook. Not about Paris, only about Los Angeles. City of angels, he wrote in his notebook, and then clipped the pen to the notebook so they would always be together. Ian taps his cigarette and smokes it, and taps it some more and smokes it some more until it burns to the filter. He carefully extinguishes the butt into a mound of dirt that he has collected beside him. Ian remembers listening to the stories after the rain stopped. He remembers he'd wanted to leave, because after the rain, he likes to trek to the large, open concrete drains of Los Angeles and watch the water rush to the ocean. The water rushes to the ocean from the city of angels, perhaps, Ian thinks, like the blood rushes through eternity from the never-ending war between the angels. There is no rain tonight. It is dry. It has been hot day after day since the unusual summer rain. With heavy-lidded eyes, Ian lays his head down and knows that gargoyles will come again, and he wonders if he will awaken or not. And he wonders if he will be afraid or not. It's a reading. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ed, for being on our show. Now, Ed's book is available through Porcupine's Quill. It's on Amazon and on his website, edseaward.com. And for our listeners, we're going to be doing a giveaway of his book along with Amazon gift cards. It's available, the contest opens April 4th to 9th. So visit our website, gfgarrard.com/arpodcast. So thank you very much, Ed, once again, for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarrard.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there is bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.